Those Days with the Monsters, Part 64. Grey clouds hung heavily on the buildings behind Kirrel and floated in the corners of his vision. Yellow and teal still glimmered in patches on the steaming rubble, and there was an unpleasant stink of greenish Tizik's blood. In his arms, Nryxə nestled with her 7 eyes closed, her face tucked against his ribcage in an attempt to hide the smell of death. Kirrel wasn't actually sure if Tizik's could smell, but he didn't want to risk letting Nryxə know what they were walking through. The star had set and risen again over them, once, twice, and now it shed long horizontal blue rays over the rubble a third time as it crept up in a dark violet dawn sky. Finding water was fairly easy in the grander areas, where fountains flowed, hopefully relatively free of infectious diseases, but food was not so easy to come by, and other areas were full of Tiziks and awful rasping wails. He couldn't understand them, but Nryxə would, and Kirrel didn't want her to be able to hear what he suspected they meant. So between the larger buildings and open plazas, he crept to look for food, holding her close to his chest, avoiding the grey fog as much as possible. On and on and on. Occasionally, Kirrel would feel his frills flush blue, and his chest ached heavily, but he found himself moving in spite of it.
If I was going to be stopped by these things, he supposed, I would have lain down on Nryxə and turned blue long before now.
And besides, now there was Nryxə to take care of, and he couldn't stop. Not for blue grief, not for mist, not for anyone. Deep blue-black shadows began to recede as the star rose higher. Kirrel was beginning to feel like he'd passed each building before. The empty spaces of open, low-cut vegetation looked exactly the same as every other space of vegetation. Maybe the same as every space of low-cut vegetation he'd ever seen. There was a strange kind of vague detachment between his eyes and his mind, as if he were watching a recorded message sent across known space. The only difference was the quiet, insistent whisper in his head.
I cannot stop.
A large building had an open door and didn't seem too damaged, if you ignored the way the door itself lay in the street, half broken. Kirrel was finding things like that easier and easier to ignore, and his primary thought was whether he had already visited this building, whether there might be food for Nryxə inside. There was, a bit, in some sort of preservative wrapping. Kirrel couldn't read the label. The Tiziks use a different writing system from the Galactic Standard script, but Nryxə was old enough to read, and when Kirrel asked her if the food in the wrapping was from plants, she bobbed her head up and down.
Good enough.
He tore the package open rather more messily than he would have hoped, but the unmistakable smell of roots filled the room, and Nryxə ate happily. Kirrel was starting to feel fairly hungry himself, but that didn't really matter. She was a child, and she needed it more. Kirrel realised he hadn't really been paying attention until a gentle tap on his feet caught his notice. Nryxə was holding up a handful of the roots from the package towards him, clicking.
No, thank you. I'm not hungry. You should eat it.
Nryxə looked at him again with what he was beginning to learn was something between annoyance and scolding, and held up the handful again. Kirrel felt vaguely uncomfortable, though whether that was from the unpleasantly warm room or from refusing Nryxə's clearly offered assistance was unclear.
What? How would you know if I'm hungry?
Nryxə rattled and smacked his feet with her flailing appendages, stretching up further with the roots. Kirrel gave up and ate them, to her apparent satisfaction. She reached up with more, but Kirrel refused these until he was sure she'd eaten enough. By the time Nryxə had scolded him again in the Tizik's clicks and rattles, with a few smacks on his feet for good measure, Kirrel decided with purple flushed frills that he should probably not be quite so stubborn in the future. It was clearly upsetting for Nryxə, and that was the last thing he wanted. After another bite of roots, Kirrel realised that he was panting a bit. The room was slowly growing warmer. There was a quiet hiss behind the walls that he recognised from days of walking past green and gold rubble.
We shouldn't be in here. We shouldn't be near here.
In another moment, Kirrel realised that he had snatched up Nryxə, roots and all, and was rushing down the Tizik-sized halls. He hoped he remembered where the door was. The idea of being trapped in a room with all that heat was awful. The smooth coating on one wall had cracked and was puffing out grey mist. Kirrel held his breath and dodged through it, feeling a sort of delayed pain as the heat struck his shoulder. He hoped he'd shielded Nryxə well. A gap in the building wall let in clear blue-white light through the haze. Kirrel couldn't tell if it was technically the same door they'd come in by, but it went to the outside, and that was enough. His muscles ached from heat and from holding his breath for so long. He'd emptied his back reserves entirely already. His metabolism had hit its limit. A burst of last-ditch speed and they were outside, in the light, in a miraculously clear space in the fog. Kirrel half fell, trying to cushion Nryxə, and gasped for breath. He'd never simply run out of energy like this before. He'd never held his breath until his muscles couldn't get their oxidizers and gave up. He knew it happened, but it had never happened to him. Nryxə rattled. Kirrel looked down and discovered that she'd managed to bring the roots with them, though she had spilled some juice from the package over herself and him. His frills flushed white and purple. They were outside, and they were still alive, and they were messy. It was a strange feeling, this mix of joy and embarrassment. He wondered if there was a name for it. By the time Kirrel had collected his thoughts and wiped off Nryxə's appendages, the building behind them had begun to collapse inward on itself, slowly consumed by the teal and gold reaction. It was time to move on before the fog blew in again, and he found himself in need of reserves he didn't have. The sky abruptly roared with a bone-shaking rattle. Kirrel crouched lower, clutching Nryxə to his chest, as the rattle changed to a series of deafening chirps and a run of semi-melodic clicks that vibrated the spines of his frills against each other. Nryxə grabbed at his arms, her face buried against him. Kirrel could feel her little vocal sac inflating and deflating rapidly. He hoped it wasn't panic. He didn't know how to deal with panic.
This is probably panic. I think I'm panicking. How do I stop panicking?
Before his rattled brain could put anything together, something horribly large and very fast slammed into the ground on the other side of the building with a dull boom. A flood of grey clouds covered Kirrel's vision. He closed his inner eyelids and held his breath, hoping they would clear quickly and that the thing that fell wouldn't create more of them. There was a sound of rattling and walking, footsteps that didn't sound like Tizik's, and far too many of them. Kirrel crept closer to the back of the building, remembering the look on Gux's face that he now suspected was fear, the empty voice as he was talking about all the species that would attack the Tizik's. He hoped the flimsy and slowly sinking wall would protect him and Nryxə from what was probably a ship and the invaders aboard it. It seemed unlikely. Footsteps on the other side of the building went on and on. The initial concentration dispersed, but a few drew closer, and then closer still. Kirrel withdrew into the shadow of the building as far as the heat would allow, holding his breath against the mist. The footsteps halted, then continued.
2 sets? 3?
Depended on how many legs were involved. A low mumble of sounds he didn't know, probably communication, muttered back and forth, now very close to the edge of the building. And then, a word Kirrel knew. He didn't know the meaning, but it didn't matter. That was a word he knew, and he caught his breath, heedless of the stinging mist, and shrieked it back.
Bitch, bitch, bitch!
There came a muffled sound, then the footsteps clattered around the corner. 3 bipeds in orange suits. Kirrel coughed, feeling the grey mist stinging his eyes and throat, and stumbled towards them with exhausted limbs, cradling Nryxə close to his ribs. There was a feeling of something hot and sore near his heart, but it wasn't really there. Kirrel's legs gave out as the unmistakable clumsy shape of a Kuman caught him on the way down. He found himself crying. Exhaustion, pain, loneliness, fear. Could have been anything he'd felt since he last saw them. But whatever it was, it overwhelmed his purple frills, and he held Nryxə as he was held by a Kuman. And he cried. Thank you for coming back to listen. I appreciate you joining me.